Earnie Shavers will be the subject of today's podcast. In 2018, December of 2018, when Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder first met in the ring, and it was one of the best heavyweight fights of the last 20 years or so. Deontay Wilder, who a lot of people have compared to Earnie Shavers, because they both have that incredible knockout power that is almost above anything else we've ever seen in boxing. No one else has that punch, that one punch power that Earnie Shavers and Deontay Wilder tend to have. When Wilder knocked down Fury in 2018 and somehow, some way, Fury got off the canvas, the fight ended in a draw, although some say that Fury did enough to actually win that fight. When that happened, it was almost like history was repeating itself, because in a late 70s fight between Earnie Shavers and the legendary Larry Holmes, who in my opinion is the greatest heavyweight champion we've seen since Muhammad Ali, in that fight, Earnie Shavers knocked down Larry Holmes in one of the most vicious, cleanly landed, powered punches you will ever see in heavyweight championship boxing. That fight was for a title in 79, and Larry Holmes got up. Just like Tyson Fury in December of 2018, Larry Holmes somehow, because of the heart of a champion, gets up from the most powerful punch in the history of boxing that we've ever seen, or that's ever been on tape. It's very similar. What happened between Wilder and Fury was history repeating itself, because we saw that happen in 79. And that is why so many people compare Deontay Wilder to Earnie Shavers, because they both have a superpower. And every time they fight, it makes it so interesting, because you never know at what point of the fight you're going to see that superpower unleashed. And it's something that, at least on tape, we've never seen in the division ever since. And that's why so many people compare Shavers to Wilder. Now, Shavers, in my opinion, this may be an unpopular opinion, because Shavers never did win a heavyweight title, and it's very difficult to compare fighters between generations, but I think what Shavers was able to do in heavyweight, at least contending for a heavyweight title, is more impressive than what we're seeing from Deontay Wilder. And that is simply because the era of boxing in the 1970s was so much more competitive, and there was no real significant dodging, meaning the best fighters fought the best fighters. Really, a lot less politics were involved, like we see in the division now. And truth be told, the 1970s, for a guy like me who wasn't around back then, looking back on that time period and studying the film of that day, it makes me very envious of how incredible boxing, particularly heavyweight championship fighting, must have been in the era of Earnie Shavers. You had an incredible litany of characters and champions that were on TV regularly. And that includes guys like Ken Norton, obviously Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, as we just said, guys like Ron Lyle, and of course George Foreman, and even a guy like Tiger Williams. And with the exception of George Foreman, Earnie Shavers faced all of those guys. Now, Earnie Shavers finished his career 74-14-1, 68 of those wins coming by way of knockout. He holds one of the highest percentages of knockout to win ratios and overall knockout ratios in the history of boxing. He's not a Hall of Famer, and he never won a world title. He fought twice for a world title, but Earnie Shavers never really surmounted that mountaintop, so to speak. Something that Deontay Wilder has done in a very less competitive environment, in my personal opinion. So Ernie Shavers, 74, 14-1, 68 of those wins coming by way of knockout. He was active from 1969 to 1983. Of course, he did have comeback efforts in 1987 and 1995 even. You know, you're talking about a guy who was 49 years old at that point, fighting at the Ho Chunk Casino in Wisconsin Dells, a favorite vacation land in the Midwest, the Wisconsin Dells. And it's sad to see that. I don't particularly like a fighter feeling like they have to come out of a retirement to do that. But in 87 and 95, Shavers did come back. But the main time of his career, 69 to 83. I mean, that's maybe the best overall heavyweight boxing that we've ever seen in the history of the sport. And Shavers was right there in the middle of it with that superpower, one punch knockout ability. Like Deontay Wilder, Earnie Shavers was a bit undersized. Now, of course, Deontay Wilder is a lot taller than Earnie Shavers, but Deontay Wilder is very skinny. He's a little bit over 200 pounds. Shavers is well over 200 pounds in his day, but smaller size at about 6 feet even. And, the comparisons to Deontay Wilder continue a little bit because Earnie Shavers is also from Alabama. He was born in Alabama. And, of course, Deontay Wilder, the Bronze Bomber, fighting out of Alabama as well. Now, Earnie Shavers would team up with Don King later in his career and would fight most prominently out of the state of Ohio, where Don King's stable of boxers always were out of. Don King, a Cleveland area-based promoter. A lot of his fighters would reside in that Cleveland area when they were working under Don King. So, he started actually like Deontay Wilder, boxing pretty later in life. Earnie Shavers, he started boxing at 22, which is pretty later in life. A guy known as the puncher of the century. And, 22 years old, has not a huge amateur background. He wins the AAU national heavyweight title, which is obviously very impressive. And Wilder also getting that bronze in the Beijing games. They both had huge, hugely impressive amateur accomplishments. Shavers didn't spend too much time as an amateur, maybe because he just didn't have that much time, kind of maybe playing catch up since he entered the sport so late in life. Now, early in Shavers' career, he does struggle a little bit, losing some of his early fights. It's not unheard of. A prospect who's coming up in the sport, fighting some of those 4-round, 6-round events. Maybe you catch a tough break here and there. You're learning about the sport as a professional. So it's not like Shavers was this guy who got onto the scene with like a 35-0 record or something crazy like that. He lost a couple of early matches in his professional career, and he also fought a lot of, while he was knocking out people almost every time when he wasn't winning, when he wasn't losing, he actually wasn't fighting, the great competition that the division had to offer when he was starting out. Just really fighting essentially no big names that you would ever really have heard of. And that all changes when he teams up with Don King. Don King has changed the careers of so many heavyweight fighters. And, of course, this was the case with Earnie Shavers as well. Don King starts to get him some really impressive fights. And he defeats a guy by the name of Jimmy Young, who you may have heard of, who was a pretty important fighter back in that day, a guy fighting out of Philadelphia. And then his first standout professional win comes in 1973 when he defeats former heavyweight champ Jimmy Ellis. After that huge win over Ellis, he has a little bit of a setback, losing to Jerry Quarry in 1973. And Jerry Quarry was someone who Jimmy Ellis lost the WBA title to in 1969. This was a setback for Shavers. It wasn't a massively embarrassing loss, but he did lose to Jerry Quarry. And if you guys are familiar with Jerry Quarry, we were talking about all those great heavyweight contenders of that era. Certainly Jerry Quarry is in that mix as well. Jimmy Ellis too, who Earnie Shavers defeated. But Corey had a bit of a sad life, dying at 53 years old. He had one of the most severe and early, I think, onset dementia that I know of. It was really something really heartbreaking because Corey was a super popular fighter back in his heyday, and the Bellflower Bomber, Irish Jerry Corey, actually he was from California, so an Irish American fighter. He did die at 53 years old in 1999, and that was a guy who was a very crowd-pleasing fighter because he would leave it all out there in the ring. He paid little attention to his defense. He would just go right for the kill, so to speak, and he was a huge crowd favorite. And this was actually a guy who Earnie Shavers struggled with in his early rise in the division. And again, so early 70s Shavers, he has that exciting one punch knockout ability. He's a huge fan favorite because of this. The fact that Shavers can end a fight no matter how far he's down on the cards in a matter of a split second, has the fans' interest. He has him on television regularly. And so Shavers also smart enough to team up with Don King at this time. He's becoming a household name in this extremely crowded division of heavyweight title contenders during this era. So in 1975, he gets maybe his most famous fight up until that point for him in his career, and that came at the Coliseum in Denver against a guy fighting out of Denver, Ron Lyle. Now, Ron Lyle was as good as it got in the heavyweight division at that time, and these guys go 6 brutal rounds. It might be called one of the greatest, if not the greatest, slugfests in boxing history. Ron Lyle was a part of two of those epic fights that could have been considered some of the best and most brutal slugfests ever in heavyweight championship fighting. And that was a fight that Ron Lyle had against George Foreman, another extremely brutal Ron Lyle fight. And in 1976, that Ron Lyle-George Foreman fight was the fight of the year, and Foreman won in the 5th. So Shavers, again, he's fighting the best of the best. And in 1975, this fight against Ron Lyle taking place in Denver sees Shavers drop Lyle in an early round with a murderous left hook. And, Shavers was the guy more known for his right, but he drops Lyle earlier in the fight. But this fight is available to watch, and it's worth watching because even though you think Shavers has it when he brutally knocks down Ron Lyle in those early rounds. Well, Ron Lyle being the champion that he was, he rose, and in the 6th, Ron Lyle comes back and beats Earnie Shavers with a knockout. So these fights, they didn't have holding. When you go back and you watch these fights, it's like nonstop punching. There's no grabbing. And that's, again, why I'm saying this 1970s, it just cannot be compared to what we watch now. If you put yourself in that time period, and it's like, wow, no wonder boxing was so much more popular back then than it is now. These guys aren't holding. They're just nonstop punching. There's no grabbing. Maybe out of sheer exhaustion, the two fighters would lean on each other, or maybe their heads would meet. Not like it was a headbutt, but just out of sheer exhaustion, they would just kind of lean on each other. That's the worst you'd see. And if they did that, it meant they had just gone through a crazy exchange, and they just had nothing left in the tank. But you would never see holding really in these fights, like the Ron Lyle versus Earnie Shaver fights. And listen to these old timers that tell you that boxing was way better back in their day, because when you watch tape of fights like Ron Lyle versus Earnie Shavers in 75, it's quite evident that it was a much different sport. at that era, especially in the heavyweight division. So Tiger Williams is a large heavyweight title contender in this era as well. He is a lot taller than Shavers and has a lot of weight on him. Tiger Williams, also known as Roy Williams. He fights out of Philadelphia, and in Las Vegas in December of '76, Tiger, Roy Williams, and Earnie Shavers go at it in what might be one of the lesser known, greatest heavyweight fights ever. So in the 10th round of this fight, and I obviously encourage you all to check it out, it should have been stopped. Shavers was getting overwhelmed by Tiger Williams. And what happened in the 10th round? And this fight was only scheduled to go 10 rounds. What happens is the ref gives Earnie Shavers what's known as a standing 8 count. Now, since 1998, this standing 8 count has been pretty much outlawed in boxing. You don't see standing 8 counts anymore. Essentially, if you're not familiar with what standing 8 count is, it's when you're getting destroyed pretty much, and a ref will have to step in there, and instead of what you'd see now, the ref waving the fight over, a standing 8 count would have the ref kind of stop the action and give the guy who's getting beat up an 8 count and make sure he's not knocked out. You just don't see that anymore, because instead of going to the standing 8 count, the fight will just be over. And back when the standing 8 count was a thing, when Tiger Williams fought Earnie Shavers in '75, Earnie Shavers, by luck of being in 1975, gets that standing 8 count. He was getting demolished. The fight should have been over by today's standards, and by the pretty much the good safety standards, that fight should have probably been over. But the ref lets it go on after the standing 8 count, and Shavers comes back and knocks out and beats Roy Williams in that 10th and final round. All of that action taking place in the same round. That was one of the best rounds of heavyweight boxing you'll ever see. The 10th round of Tiger Williams versus Earnie Shavers must be seen, because I'm telling you, this standing 8 count, it's a game changer. When that thing was in play in boxing, it was a completely different sport. Because we see so many times in boxing these days, and I'm not advocating that the standing 8 count should come back. I don't think it should. I'm just trying to convey and explain that it is such a different sport without the standing 8 count. Because we see so many times in boxing that the ref has to make a really important decision right then and there. Should the fight be over, or should the fight go on? Do you jump in and end it right then and there? It's the most difficult thing a ref has to do. And I always err on the side of ending the fight early for fighter safety. But when the standing 8 count was in play, the ref would say if they were on the fence that the fight should be over, they would just go for the standing 8 count, and kind of, it's almost like a timeout. Although there is no timeout in boxing, this is close to like a ref calling a timeout that really impacts the match that you'll ever see. Of course, the standing 8 count was outlawed. I just think what boxing officials may have thought was, it's just too brutal to do that. If you're gonna step in there as a ref, just end the fight. Don't allow the standing 8 counts. That's what I think is the reason why they outlawed it. Now, a standing 8 count is different than a mandatory 8 count. The mandatory 8 count is anytime there is a knockdown, the fighter gets a mandatory 8 count to recover. Little different. So that should make a little more sense. But 76, the standing 8 count, very much in play, and it is the reason why Shavers was able to come back and defeat Tiger Roy Williams. Now, Earnie Shavers is a opponent of Muhammad Ali. That might be why his name is the most such a household name for a guy that never won a world title, for a guy that's not in Canastota, enshrined in the Boxing Hall of Fame. A reason maybe you know the name Earnie Shavers, other than the fact that he is arguably the most powerful puncher in the history of boxing, is because he also fought Muhammad Ali. Now, in 77 Madison Square Garden, Muhammad Ali and Earnie Shavers are set to go 15 rounds. Muhammad Ali is inching towards, the later stages of his career. And all the heavyweight titles, all the alphabet suit heavyweight titles, including the lineal heavyweight title, are on the line in this fight. So this will be the first of 2 times that Earnie Shavers has a title shot. Now, Shavers starts out this match pretty impressively. He wins round 2. But for some reason, he just doesn't have that courage or whatever it is, that extra energy, that extra sense of kill, so to speak. He doesn't, he doesn't have that killer instinct, we'll call it, to go for the knockout on the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali, in that second round. You can watch that second round and you'll see Shavers has, the champ on the ropes, and it's he maybe hesitates for a couple extra seconds more, and it costs him the fight because, Muhammad Ali outlasts that second round when, Shavers just doesn't go for the kill. I don't know why. I don't know if it was a conditioning issue or he just thought, subconsciously Muhammad Ali by this time is really becoming such a beloved figure in American pop culture. Maybe he just has a subconscious thing in his head that he doesn't want to hurt the champ, this larger than life humanitarian in Muhammad Ali. Maybe that plays into a role. Whatever the case it is, Muhammad Ali, this is Muhammad Ali. These are the fights why we call Muhammad Ali the greatest of all time, and it's because he somehow, some way avoided the knockout from Shavers in that second round and went on to win in a unanimous decision. And in the 15th round, Muhammad Ali is incredible. He nearly knocks out Earnie Shavers in that 15th and final round. There's no question that Muhammad Ali came back and won this fight, pretty convincingly, after the fact that Shavers pretty much had him almost beat in that second round. A sports writer for Sports Illustrated called the 15th round against Shavers as magnificent as any round Muhammad Ali has ever fought. And the prize money for that fight, $300,000 for Shavers and $3 million for Ali. But more importantly for the champ, he went home with the titles still intact. So Shavers, he's not done at this time. Clearly, he did do a strong showing in that fight against Ali, and he gets a shot against a non-title fight against Larry Holmes in 1978 that he loses in a unanimous decision. In 79, Shavers beats Kenny Norton in 1979 in the first round. Just one of the most impressive performances by Earnie Shavers. One of those performances of Earnie Shavers that you just sit back and go, I cannot believe a human being can punch as hard as this. It's just so impressive. And so in 79, he gets a second opportunity to fight Larry Holmes. He had lost him in 78 on the unanimous decision. Now he gets a chance to fight Holmes for the WBC title. Again, both fights taking place at Caesar's Palace against Larry Holmes. I believe they were outdoor fights. There was never really a permanent venue at Caesar's Palace. It was always being held outdoors. And, in this COVID environment that we find ourselves in 2020, maybe when fight fans are more regularly being allowed to attend matches, you will see more fights taking place outdoors in temporary stadiums. But Larry Holmes 2, Shavers Holmes 2. This is again, one of the most famous fights in heavyweight championship boxing. Again, Earnie Shavers is a part of it. It's for the WBC title, and Shavers delivers one of the hardest punches, maybe the hardest punch Larry Holmes has ever got delivered to him. Holmes gets, and again, Holmes is a guy who fought Mike Tyson later in his career when Holmes was pretty much at the end of his career, but I don't think anyone ever hit Holmes as hard as Shavers did. And that's a kind of a viral video of Shavers delivering this punishment to Larry Holmes. But just like, Fury got up against Wilder, Holmes gets up against Shavers. And this is the knock on someone who has this superpower of that one punch knockout ability. This is maybe the downside. When someone gets up against your superpower, how deflating is that? And how draining is that on your psyche? This is what you have, and you delivered it flush, and now someone's getting up against it. So we love to see someone that has that, as Teddy Atlas calls it, the eraser. We love to see someone with that knockout power as a fan, but as a complete fighter, you obviously need more than just that knockout ability. It's like a home run hitter in baseball. If the wind's blowing in and the conditions just aren't completely aligned for you to hit one out of the park, you really don't have much left in your arsenal. I think Earnie Shavers was more of a complete fighter than he gets credit for. I do. But in this fight against Kenny Norton, in this fight against Larry Holmes, when Holmes gets up, how deflating does that have to be? And just like clockwork, Larry Holmes gets up, and he goes up, and he actually ends up winning this fight in a stoppage in the 11th. That was the last real significant fight of Earnie Shavers' career. It was the last title chance he ever had. Shavers would go on to get knocked out by Randall Tex Cobb in 1980. 36 or 7 years old at this point, fighting at the Joe Louis Arena in Detroit. And, he does actually beat Aussie Joe. He beats Aussie Joe Bugner in 1982, a fight taking place in Dallas. He TKOs him in round 2, but, after that fight against Holmes, that was essentially the end of Earnie Shavers' shot at winning a title. But nonetheless, an incredible career, someone that everyone in boxing seems to know because of the fights against Ali, because of just the legend of how strong his punching ability was. And, Earnie Shavers is definitely someone that's worth talking about as a character. He was kind of a quiet guy when he retired. I think he went on to some ministry work, working in the faith-based community. It seems that he lived for a while. He may still even live there. In the UK, of course, the UK fans are traditionally, they treat the champions of yesteryear, with such great respect and dignity, maybe more than you see in the United States. Perhaps that was some of the reason why Shavers decided to live in the UK for a bit. But, mostly fighting out of Ohio. He actually worked in the late 60s at a major GM plant out there near Youngstown, Ohio, for a while before he was able to really make a lot of money in the sport. Just a guy that, he fought them all, with the exception of George Foreman in that era. For whatever reason, Foreman and Shavers never mixed it up together in the ring. I don't know too much of why that happened. I don't know if there's politics behind it. For the most part, like I was saying earlier, there really wasn't a lot of politics between the guys now fighting each other. It just was a natural thing. Oh, yeah, we're the best, so we fight. But he never fought against Foreman. And Foreman, again, is one of these guys who actually arguably had as much power as Shavers. I don't think Foreman was as hard a puncher as Shavers, but it's like really close. It's like 1 and 1A. So that would have been a great matchup. Unfortunately for us fight fans, that did never happen. But Earnie Shavers, a tip of the cap to you on today's episode of the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I enjoyed going back and watching old Earnie Shavers fights. Take care, everyone.